All right, Mayor, whenever you're ready, we can go ahead and... You're good? All right, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the final meeting. I'm assuming, but again, and you'll probably hear this a lot, but thank you all for the time that you've given us, and I think the citizens will be pleased with what we come up with. So with that being said, I'm going to call the roll, and I don't have that list.
I'll call it.
Bob,
Thank you, Mayor. So if you're here, if you will just indicate so. Beth Dowdy, John Fishwick, Renee Brown, Betty Jean Wolfe, Lorraine Lang, Yodi Swain, Mark Lazar, Karen Pillis, Eileen Gary, Vance Overstreet, Marie Muddeman, Jeff Graffio, Rob Leonard, Annie Harvey, Anna Goltz, Latrice Hilton, Jim Sears, Cheryl Hilton, John Cornthwaite Jr., John Luger, Irisha Goodman, Judith Dickerson, Jarrell Rhodes, Brenda Hale, Abby Hamilton, Karen Mason, William Lee, Karen Mikulski-Carney, Jeremy Holmes, John Hall, Liz Ackley, Carol Tarrant, Edward Mitchell, Esteban Duran-Ballin, Kennedy Wade, and Javion Tucker. All right, Marion, you do have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we have the reading and approval of the minutes.
And just one clarification on the minutes before you accept those is Beth Dowdy mentioned, and I want to make sure that it's clear, and I will amend the minutes to reflect this so that it is clear. On the minutes from the meeting on the 25th, it indicates in there, if you remember, we went through the list where we had 30 or 40 things, and we kind of voted on those to get kind of down to the list that was maybe 15 or so. They are not presented and not intended to be presented in rank order, but they are numbered 1 through so on, and it does appear that. So I'll make that clear that those were not presented in any kind of rank order. So that'll be one amendment, if everyone's comfortable with that, to those minutes. That's the only change that I'm aware of, Mayor. I don't know if there were others.
Okay. All those in favor of the amended minutes?
Oh, Beth's got a question. Yep. Yep. And Angie's got the mic.
Sorry. If I could clarify that again. So why is the voting tally not in the minutes?
They can be. We could do that. So yeah, maybe that's a better clarification, is to actually provide the tally for each of them. Because remember, what we did was we added up kind of what each one of those that did appear on there, what they received in the votes. So maybe what I'll do, if it's okay, I'll clarify that list was not presented in order, but it'll show then what the number was.
I just think that was action. We didn't vote, but we
Yep.
took action.
Yep.
And perhaps that should be in the minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
All right. So we're asking for the approval of the minutes as stated. All right.
Yeah, you can just do it by all indicating support, Mayor, if you
right.
choose.
Everybody in favor, let it be known by the saying of aye. All opposed? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I should have mentioned this as well. We'll be referring to the minutes from the public hearing, from Monday's public hearing, as we go through. So I may point back to that as we work our way through the discussion as well. So.
All right. Report of all.
One. I can pass it around.
Are there any reports to be made?
No reports, no.
All right. Okay, we'll go right into new business and. Bob?
All right. Thank you, Mayor. And again, thank you all, because I know it feels like we were just in this room, and we were. So I know Angie told me that we had 91 folks sign up for or at the public hearing on Monday, and 34 spoke. So I guess our fears of having maybe one or two show up didn't pan out. So certainly I think you all expressed it, the mayor expressed it at the end of the meeting, found the public hearing beneficial. I think everyone that came appeared to have certainly taken their responsibility seriously as well. So certainly was very pleased with the turnout, and also will thank all of you who helped kind of spread the word about that public hearing and what went on. So today's mission is straightforward but difficult. And so what we are really trying to accomplish today is two things. One of those is to take that list that we have been working from of those big lifts and get it to something that actually you believe represents the priorities that you would recommend to the council and that is fiscally constrained, meaning it can actually be paid for through the funding that has been received. That's one and probably the primary challenge tonight. The other is to see if we can also advance on at least identifying projects for the recovery phase. Remember, we've got this broken into the resiliency phase and the recovery phase. We have been obviously focused a lot on the resiliency because that's where the big lifts reside. We have not talked a whole lot about the recovery. For the most part, everything that's kind of resting in the recovery right now are still really illustrative projects. We will not be trying at the recovery to get down to the specific dollars associated with those. It'll be more, and I'll give you an example. For example, if there was a desire to provide funding for residents in the community that have suffered a financial loss and that are facing unpaid bills, let's say that would just simply appear in the recovery as one of the items, and we're not going to say allocate $100,000 to that, allocate $50,000. We won't get into that level of detail. That'll be something that will get worked out as that information goes to council. What you will say is how much funding will go into that whole category, so that whole area for recovery funds under each of those. Remember, right now, I've got kind of a placeholder that 20% of the funding goes into recovery. That may not be where you all want to end up with when we get down to the end. But so that'll be charge number 2, and I kind of alluded to, I said 2, but really it's 2.5, because along with those is we need to settle out how much funding is in which of those 2 buckets, people and places, and how much funding is in resiliency and recovery, because what I've presented at this point really is kind of a placeholder in that regard. So, Angie, look at your audio's not working. Okay. We're making sure the audio is working as it gets broadcast out. Well, I'm going to continue, and then certainly they can catch up with it as well. So those are the 2 things. So I want to start by asking the question, because really in response to the public hearing. Part of the reason to conduct the public hearing, there were really 2 reasons. One was to hear from area residents their response to the list of the preliminary priority investments that you all have identified through this process. That was number 1. And the second was also to hear any other ideas that perhaps had not come up through the discussion prior to that. So those are the 2 things that were supposed to occur with the public hearing. And again, I tried to capture on the minutes. What I did is, as every person got up and spoke, and they indicated a project or an initiative, I wrote that down. So that's what you have in your minutes. So when you see something in there that says like skate park, and it has a number 5 next to it, it means that 5 times that was mentioned by folks that stood up. So sometimes somebody stood up and actually said 4 or 5 things. Those are recorded on there. Sometimes they stood up and said 1 thing. That's recorded on there. I also indicated in the email that went out to you that along the way, I have been receiving, as we had indicated people could do, I've been receiving emails from folks who are either reinforcing what you heard at the public hearing or themselves introducing ideas that may not have otherwise been heard. For the most part, and again, those were in the email, and I listed kind of what those were. For the most part, I'll say that they pretty much replicated what was at the public hearing. Obviously, I got a lot of emails about a skate park. Obviously, I got emails about affordable housing and so on. But you can reference those in the email as to anything that might have been different than what you might have seen. So the first place that I want to begin is to reference back to the list that we have been working from all along. So that list of the ones that we presented at the public hearing, which were, I don't remember the number, 15 items or something that were associated with that list. And first question I'm going to ask you is, based off of what you heard at the public hearing or what you saw in the email from what I've received in emails, are there any projects or initiatives that came from those that you would add right now, just for this moment, you would add to your preliminary list, so the list that you've already created? Are there any of those items that you heard that you would add to that list at this point? Marie, you look like you were going to raise your hand.
Whether they hit the top 3 or 4.
So the question about whether it hits the top 3 or 4, remember, we got it down, you all got it down to about 11, is that what it was? So you got it down to 11. So really the question is, did you hear anything at the hearing or see anything in the other information that I provided that you would add to that 11? We're going to have to go through a process still today to get that number down lower, because right now it's more than the funding we have. But really, do you have anything you want to add to that 11?
I'm going to make a suggestion that, a lot of people did get up and present some new ideas, and 3 minutes really is not enough time to figure out, at least for me, whether it was a worthy idea or not. And I was wondering if we should put aside, a small amount of money for proposals for resilient items that people have talked about that maybe are good ideas, where they can go into a little bit more depth during a proposal, and then the city council or your staff could decide whether it was a worthy idea or not. And we had a few items on our list that didn't get money that maybe we could add to at that time, and just let people have proposals, and then let your staff decide whether it was worthy.
So one of the suggestions I would make to that regard is, certainly anybody who wants to sort of respond to that now can, but then also if it seems like something that you'd like to have considered, then let's pin that to the end of the conversation to see where you end up with the money, because that'll help, I think, answer part of that question.
Right.
Thank you. So I heard several things during the hearing that I thought were new, that we hadn't discussed very much, but there was one item in particular that stood out as possibly a big expense that we haven't heard before, and I think it's at least conceptually a good idea. Michelle Davis discussed the idea of what she called a college laboratory partnership school, which, as I understand it, is a way to take advantage of the expertise that exists in the community and provide that to students, even at the elementary level, and provide them with a better understanding of how science works and how they can be engaged with it, which, as an educator and a scientist myself, I find really appealing. Now, of course, if we're in the business of building a facility to do that, that's going to cost a great deal of money. But there is the possibility, at least conceptually, that we could find an existing building that could be adapted for that purpose and maybe not cost quite so much.
Thank you. And that was the laboratory school, and I think there were maybe 2 other folks at the hearing that mentioned that one too. They did. It's a loose proposal, like everything is, right?
Oops.
And by the way, I'm going to have to, after this question, I'm going to ask you if there's anything you want to remove from your list based off of what you heard. Brenda, you want to go ahead? Brenda, you want to go? And then Karen go?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. The one thing that I still have not seen and am concerned about is, from the very beginning, I talked about minorities that have lost their businesses, and then referring to the SBA to train and help them sustain their business. So when I see the word right here on the number 2 people, it's a workforce skills development pathway initiative. I don't see the word minority. And the reason I'm saying this is because I know through the years, you can start off saying everything that you want to say, that minorities are going to be taken care of, but if you don't have a way for them to be aware of what's available to them, then everybody that comes to the table first, they get all the money. And again, you have the minority businesses and the small businesses left out. So that's what I'm concerned about. And I need some kind of reassurance from you or anybody that can tell me that we're not going to miss out on this opportunity for them.
So, couple different things, because there's actually a couple things in there. So, one of them is right now you do not have a resiliency item. It is listed in the recovery items about small business assistance. So right now that does not exist in the resiliency items in there. The minority piece, the way we handled it with the businesses, the way we handled it the last time, is because there are some legal questions about our ability to say, if you are a registered minority or women-owned business, that's not an issue. Many of our minority-owned businesses are not registered minority or women-owned businesses. What we did last time to try, in the CARES Act, to try to address that is we gave preference to small businesses that were located within certain zip codes, certain areas of our community, which were not exclusively minority-owned, but dominated by minority-owned. So I would anticipate we would do something similar to that if that project makes its way through. Second piece, you talked about the pathways, the career pathways piece of it and stuff. And right now, that would not cover the businesses. Those are really for individuals that have lost their jobs or are at risk of losing their jobs, who are seeking some other pathway to employment. And so far, that conversation has been focused more on probably socioeconomic status, really looking for individuals that are coming from the impoverished parts of the city. So I think by default, again, it will capture those, but we probably do need to make certain that it's more explicit about what the focus is. But I do want to make sure that that's understood, that right now, the only business programs that you all have identified, specific business programs, are in the recovery section, which is those are the smaller dollar amounts in there. But that's how we would approach it and stuff. So, Karen, you want to? Yes. Get ready.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that I wanted to mention that I think it was Ted Edlick's comment about moving African American students into college completion. The educational component is critical, and then also Tom Carr's comment about the affordable housing, but basically establishing a revolving loan fund. I thought that was a great idea for rehabs. And then just including universal daycare in the hub projects. Universal daycare seemed to be a theme.
Yeah, so one of the items with say the universal daycare, mental health came up as well in some of the discussions in those hubs. I think it would be, if the hubs make it through the process, I think one of the things we've talked about is kind of that comprehensive set of services that would be a part of that as well. So we'll probably, when we describe it, we'll probably want to clarify that piece of it. The revolving loan fund one is a little bit tricky because I'm not sure. You're not allowed to use the ARPA funds to borrow money, for example. We can't use it to borrow money. You can't use it to pay debt. And you can't use it to build up kind of a fund balance or a reserve account. I'm not sure, though, that there's not a way that you couldn't do something that would result in some kind of revolving loan. But we would have to look further if that makes it on kind of the list. So, all right, we'll try again. I'm going to step far away.
I am immensely proud of the panel and also the citizens that came in earlier in the week, of the awareness and the passion behind all of the human services and social services options that were brought to the table. I would like to bring up and remind that we've had discussion, but not a great deal, and I would be very appreciative if we could also consider funds for infrastructure. We're talking about our future with children and homelessness and so on and so forth, which is just a necessity. But if the infrastructure isn't put into place, whether that be power, sewer, water, increased police force, increased firefighters, the legacy that we want to leave for the future will not have stewards to be able to take care and move forward where that's concerned. So I'd like to just sort of remind us as we're moving forward. One other entity that I would like to bring up is we've talked about a great deal of revitalizing different communities and haven't necessarily, to my knowledge, touched on perhaps Southeast Roanoke. And there are certainly some deficits there that I think that particular funding could really do a turnaround and change a lot of lives with regard to that as well. So I would like for each of us to kind of keep that in mind.
Thank you. And let me make one clarification that might help with the Southeast piece. So with the two things. One is the city has what's referred to as a target area. And so those are where at least 51% of the federal dollars that we receive through CDBG and home funds go into a particular neighborhood. For the last 6 years, that neighborhood has been the Melrose Orange target area. Currently, that's in the Belmont Fallon neighborhood, so that's where those fundings are going. Also, though, as a part of that, for example, if the affordable housing initiative that's been talked about makes it through this, I think the intent is that the majority of those expenditures for rehabilitation and for new home construction would likely end up in the Southeast as a part of that target area as well. So that's just one way that might be accommodated. So, yes, ma'am.
I was also thinking about the disenfranchised areas that we failed to mention specifically. I was thinking about the West End area, and I did see it somewhere. I was trying to find out where it was, but I hope that that area will also be included either for, well, not just either, but rehab as well as, you know, assisting with education piece and so forth.
Yeah, and one thing to remember, and it may be what you're thinking of with the West End Center, the information that was shared with you all about the food system and the food system hub, that was focused and concentrated in part in the West End Center and expanding that operation. That might have been what you remember hearing with that as well.
That may be, but I am not just thinking about the West End Center, you know,
Correct.
and the food piece, but all around.
Yep.
We had a lot of conversation about providing assistance with individuals, families, people in terms of mental health, and that is really great, wonderful, yay. But when the gentleman was talking about the meditation piece for the healthcare workers, you know, that sort of really resounded with me because I don't think we've talked a lot about those individuals who are, you know, putting life and limb, you know, at risk to keep us protected in terms of health care. And so I think that is something that we should definitely be, we want to make sure that we say it, you know, we want to support through these funds our healthcare workers, those frontline workers, because it's an issue of recovery as well as resiliency.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to hold on to that one because that particular initiative, my recollection was he talked about it being like a $20,000 initiative, and that may be a very good one to identify in the recovery side of the people portion of it, because that's the kind of program that would go into that recovery side. And I think it was Healing the Healers was kind of the name of the approach that he had. So, Rob?
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. So I don't know, there was some, I guess maybe not revelatory information the other night, but a lot of passion and a lot of things. I think that you know, we could feel individuals' pain points, and obviously the skate park was a huge presence. And just as a kind of a lead-in, using that as a lead-in to what I'm trying to figure out for myself and perhaps other members on the panel here this evening, is there's a lot of stuff here that's still in front of us. There's a lot of initiatives and projects and things that that I think to some degree warrant some degree of feasibility study. And I don't know, just perhaps for the benefit of the panel, for example, we could amalgamate the skate park into a Gainsborough or Northwest Center that would actually, for example, take the folks within the skating community and avail them to other things within that hub, so they could be availed to other educational opportunities, other workforce development opportunities. So I just am curious as to, as we advance these initiatives and projects, and we're talking about some estimated budgets, when does some level of a feasibility study occur? And more broadly, as we advance these things this evening, what's the process beyond this evening? So it seems like we're coming to, we have to come to a lot of conclusions very quickly this evening. And once it gets handed off or prior to it getting handed off to the council, how is this amalgamated and packaged, and who does it? And then what's the feasibility studies around it and the process for advancing this? And then is there any level of inclusion with the panel? You know, we've created our own kind of synergy and cross-pollination here and things that it would be my hope that the tenor doesn't get lost in the process. And it seems to me that there probably is a process. Perhaps it's modeled after the CARES funding and things like that. And I think it might be beneficial for the folks here on the panel this evening is, how do we take all this stuff and make sure, one, it's going to be able to meet the budget that we have, the overall budget, the $64 million and all that, and what level of study occurs and when does it occur, how's the panel involved here beyond this, and then what's the process for the council to be armed with robust amounts, enough of information to make a decision, and then how does that get beyond that, the feasibility study, the procurement, you know, just generally how does this all work moving forward?
And it'll probably be a number of different ways. So, and using a process somewhat similar to what we did with the CARES Act. So let me give you a few examples. So there were some things that came out of the recommendation with the CARES Act that the council adopted, which were direct funding. So I've used in the past, I'll use this example again, that there was a line item, or there was a category called safety net that was in the CARES recommended funding, and there was a certain dollar amount set aside, and one of the projects that was identified that kind of grew out of that was support of our local low cost to free health clinics in the community. And so what that translated into was direct financial contributions to Bradley Free Clinic, New Horizons, and the clinic at the rescue mission. So in that case, that was the process. The process was basically just direct fund. There were other projects, I'll use the arts projects as an example, where there was a certain amount of funding set in a category and a project identified in supporting local arts and culture groups in a variety of ways. That was actually turned over to the Arts Commission to actually push out a call, much like they do every year, for proposals and ideas, and then the Arts Commission actually vetted those ideas and awarded those dollars. There was a similar effort that was done with nonprofits and proposals that came in that didn't have to do with some of the other categories that were identified in there. This one is a little bit different in that we didn't have the amount of money we have as we do in this case, as we did with CARES. So there are some of these initiatives that are much larger and involve many more partners. And in those cases, we may end up having to do some kind of, basically the equivalent of an RFP, and actually say, okay, you know, the council has identified a project that has these components to it, and we're looking for coalitions of organizations within our community to make proposals, and then those proposals will be vetted. There is a possibility that through that process there may be a role for some of the members of the panel. We obviously can't do that with 39 members of the panel, and the panel will technically cease to exist after the recommendations are made, but that may be a way in which some of the membership can fit into it. I don't know exactly which of those will fall into it until we know which projects actually kind of make it to the cut. In terms of the question regarding feasibility, some of the projects have been vetted further than others. Skate park is one of those, and I'll talk about that if ultimately it makes it into the cut. The Northwest grocery store is a little bit further into the discussion. Others are really very preliminary at this point, and we'll have to determine, do we have the time, and do we have the need, frankly, in some cases, to go through that process. Others will have to. If, for example, the recreation center makes it on the list, there actually is a public process going on right now in the community about what to put in our recreation centers and how best to use those. But there would be some kind of process associated with that. So it's a little bit of a lot of different combinations. And I'll probably be able to give you a better sense of what those are next once we know what's actually been recommended. Hopefully that answers some. So Karen, you.
Yeah, we had identified safe, affordable housing, and we heard several people talk about that last night, and it's also in some of the emails that you received. I would really like to add the phrase affordable, accessible housing. There really is no reason why in this day and age we're not building units that at least conform to universal design, if not full accessibility. So if the panel's okay with that, I would really like to add affordable, accessible housing.
And I think that fits well with the discussion about rehabilitation too, because it opens up some other options with rehabilitation.
I think the night ended with Brent Cochran talking about some things for us to keep in mind that really resonated with me, and I think bolstered a lot of what we're thinking about. And he recommended we focus on big ideas that already have actors at play and solid footing. And so that really, I think, sort of fortified what we were looking at. There was actually two pieces in particular that stood out to me. In addition to mental health, I mean, that was just resoundingly clear that we need to put some focus there. And so I'll echo what Karen said about Tom's comment. If a revolving loan fund is a possibility, I do think we should look into that. The other one that stood out to me was the Financial Empowerment Center. And this is something that I knew about sort of on a cursory level. Tim Saribi presented on this, and when he was talking about the statistics of the amount of debt that could be erased, that was transformative. I mean, for him, for the Financial Empowerment Center to find a way to eliminate $40,000 in debt for one person, I had no idea they were working on that level of scale. And so as we look at resiliency, I actually called him today to figure out, how much would it take? And Bob, I don't know if that's something you want me to talk through right now, but.
We can. I mean, I'll probably relieve some of the pressure with that in that, the FEC was, many of you know this, it was originated through a grant program that the city applied for and secured. And then last year, the city actually converted it into a permanently funded institution. So this would allow that group, they're still somewhat on a grant, but it will allow them to come off a grant and move forward. I think what we'll do is we're actually going to shift that FEC project over to the governance side. So we will be adding it to the governance list as a way in which to dedicate some of this funding to that program and that project.
He mentioned that $1 million over 3 years would support sustainability and expansion, and that $500,000 would at least meet their sustainability goal for the next 3 years.
Yep. And we'll be having more conversations with them, but I think we'll pick that piece up in governance in some fashion. At least that's what we'll recommend to council as we move forward. So, Marie?
Two things. One, I would like a clarification. I remember something that you said about the skate park and when the Wasina Bridge is built. Is there going to be a renovation of the skate park at that point?
Yes, and again, I didn't want to, because there's more information about the skate park that may be relevant, and I did not, but since you've asked it, I will. I did not want to bias the conversation because obviously there's a lot of folks that feel very passionately about the skate park, but I will give you some additional information regarding the skate park, and it actually speaks to Rob's point about feasibility as well. So, and I'm not telling you anything that the folks that stood at the microphone with the skate park don't already know. They've been a part of these discussions along the way. So when the city started its Parks and Recreation master planning process a few years ago, that's its 10-year plan for what to invest in for Parks and Recreation. And it was a year-long process involving the community in that there was a piece of that looked at a skate park. So two things came out of that. One was a list of prioritized Parks and Recreation investments. So where do the citizens, through that process, believe the projects should be funded, what projects should be funded in what priority order. And the priorities in that plan are the 2 rec centers that we currently have being replaced and the 2 swimming pools being replaced. Those are the top 4 priorities, and indeed, we have started to try to fund those in our CIP. They are not fully funded, but those are the top priorities. The skate park, there was a feasibility study done as a part of that for the skate park. So we have a cost estimate, a real cost estimate for the skate park, and we also, through that process, it was identified that Wasena was the relocated, where it would go. Through that process, that's where the skate park is going to return. The challenge with that, obviously, is when the Main Street Bridge goes under construction, the existing skate park closes. The city has acquired and installed temporary skate amenities throughout the community for the interim period, and then a new skate park would get constructed basically where the tennis courts are in Wasena, adjacent to the bridge when the construction is concluded. So the skate park, and there is no funding for the skate park. That project is, again, because those other 4 projects I mentioned are higher up on the list, there has not been funding identified for that skate park. But when funding is identified, either through private means or through the CIP, it will go next to it on Wasena. So just something to kind of keep in mind as we go forward. If there is, and that's why some of the questions about could it go with one of these other hubs, those decisions have already been vetted through the community. And again, at the end of that process, Wasena was the selected location for the park. So.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put you on the spot again, Bob. I called Bob, and it was a Monday. We had a conversation, and I asked him how his weekend had been, and he said there was no gun violence, but there was 17 overdoses, I believe. And so I'm going to put you on the spot for you to speak about that, because I think that's this huge issue we need to address.
Sure. So, and some of this came up with some of the folks that spoke at the meeting, and Mayor and Vice Mayor know this because we've used this as part of our discussions and presentations around gun violence, that as significant, and it is significant, as gun violence is, we've had 49, 50 incidents of people being wounded with gunfire, and I think 9 fatalities this year so far. We have about 3 times that number of fatalities associated with overdoses, and increasing at a rapid pace as the year has unfolded for a variety of reasons, some of which are related to what's going on with gun violence as well. The weekend that you're referring to is actually this past weekend. There were so many patients in our hospitals recovering from COVID or responding to COVID that all the jurisdictions in the region were stressed to the point, including our hospitals, of being at risk of not being able to take folks into the emergency department and dealing with them. And most of it was dealt with overdoses at that particular time. So there is, though, I will say, part of the reason why you've not seen a lot of proposals in here regarding the opioid and other kinds of drug use issues, except for one. We've had one proposal in here about helping staff a position for the collective response. The reason that you've not seen those in there is because the city is a party to litigation against the pharmaceutical companies, which have beginning to reach settlements. Matter of fact, there was a settlement just today with the Sackler family, and those will represent sources of revenue for the next at least 18 years coming into this community to address that. So that's part of the reason why you haven't seen us stressing much of. That's the drug piece, not the mental health piece. That's the drug piece of it. So. Sure. John.
Yeah, I want to follow up on what Rob Leonard said and a couple of points that you just made, Bob. I think we don't have to be the council when they make these hard decisions. I think there will be more than $64 million. There will be money that can be leveraged. For example, the opioid lawsuit will bring more money into it. There's other state and federal money. So I don't think every choice that the council has to make is, well, if we do this project, we can't do this other project, because I think there will be other funding, and you can probably take some of the good ideas from one particular project and plug it into another project. So that's not, we don't just have to be, I don't want our citizens to think that they're bidding against each other for the dollars. That there's, again, I think everything can get done. Now, maybe it takes 10 years, but I think everything can get done. We have a lot of talent in this room, and my goodness, Monday night there was a lot of talent, I thought, that spoke about the problems in our cities and the way to fix those problems. I think we really need to take advantage of that talent when we, I guess, request bids for these projects and we try to implement these projects. There's a lot of folks who are out there that can help us. And I think when we spend the money, we need to be nimble. Some of these projects are not going to be as successful as we would hope they would be. And when we learn that, we need to switch directions and put that money somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned all of those, so I'll follow up a little bit on each of them. So one really good example of what you mentioned, there was a presentation, Mark came up and gave a presentation about this audacious, he referred to it as, objective of moving all eventually of the people who are currently in our community that are impoverished into the middle class, and he had that kind of laid out. There is a program, there is a funding opportunity through the federal EDA that matches very closely to what it is that he has proposed, and we certainly should as a city be pursuing that kind of funding opportunity. So there are some ideas, to John's point, there are some ideas that have come up in these discussions. There are some ideas that will, in effect, fall below the line, fall below the funding line that you have, that still should and will be carried forward looking for other sources of funding. That's one of those. The other is, I think you're absolutely right. I'll use the affordable housing piece as an example. You all have talked about, even though the initiative is about getting houses rehabilitated and getting homes constructed that are affordable and safe and accessible, you have also talked about incorporating as a part of that a sort of a job training and certification piece so that folks are going through programs to actually get those skills to be involved in those constructions. So that's a way to combine kind of those two. And then you said something else, John, that I was going to mention as well. So what was the other piece?
If something doesn't work.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So, and I'm going to talk about that particularly if the grocery store makes the cut. Right. So part of the reason why we've recommended holding back a certain amount of this funding is so that we can monitor the situation as it moves forward, because the conditions may change. But we also do need to have built into our process enough flexibility that if something that seems like a great idea just does not seem to be panning out, that we can pivot into one of the other ideas that you've identified, because there is an end date associated with these dollars.
And I just wanted to say one thing about the grocery store Northwest. I think if we all had to write down one project that probably we'd get 36 votes on, I think it's that.
Yeah, it actually was the highest. When you did the tally, that was number one.
And I've been, and there are more groups working on that than I knew. There were folks who came out Monday night talking about it. I've talked to folks in here who are working on it. I do think we have to seize the moment for this grocery store Northwest. One of the things the pandemic has shown us is how challenging that business is, but maybe that's a good thing. We know that now. So if we'd had this money 2 years ago, it might have been a handicap. Now we know about that. The only thing I would suggest is we really do. We've got this unusual amount of money. I think this is the moment to do the grocery store in Northwest. It may not happen, but it really ought to be everything we can do to make it happen. One minor suggestion that I have on that, spitballing ideas, is I think we should look for ways to get the Virginia Tech Business School involved in that. They could make something like this a case study. They got bright students there, they got bright professors. They might do that for free, to get their name on the map to do this. And so I think we should take all of our collective resources to make that happen, because we do have a pot of money that we can plug into this program. And so I would urge the council and folks working on this to do that.
We have partnered with Virginia Tech before. I remember a number of years ago on the lean program, lean management, they had some interns that came down, and they really went at that. And I think it's an asset that we have to have that partnership and have that research institution there to help us in some things. So it's a good idea, John. We need to look at it. We've done it before.
And then I'll come back with an item on the grocery store. And who am I?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Angie. 2 comments really quickly. I want to just echo what Lorraine said, which is that we had, by my count anyway, 37 individuals or groups that made requests, sincere, earnest, salient, pressing requests for funding. And although I agree that some of them fall into the recovery of the 20% or small dollar ask for the resiliency at the 80%, at least in its current allocation, I think we owe it to the community to put some set aside and a clear process that once City Council comes to a decision about the proposal, that in that announcement is also contained maybe a point of contact in the city for where community groups who have dollar ask under a certain dollar level can go and be put on a list to receive more information about when the RFP process is going to come out. That's my first thing. Real quick, second, I want to just reiterate what multiple people have said here, and it may have saliency and import in how we make our decision tonight, which is that when you look even at the 11 big lifts, let alone the 18 to 20 that were on our rank list from last week, there's a lot of duplication. Or if not outright duplication, there's overlap. And I am concerned about that overlap. Who's going to decide how that gets condensed? Because by my count, we have 3, possibly even 4 aspects of workforce development. Certainly violence reduction, workforce development for Northwest and or Gainsborough, workforce development that's sitting in the Roanoke City Public School piece, with moving the VOTEC from Patrick Henry to William Fleming. And then there's another aspect to that. That's just one example. Another one could be, yes, you just said that the skate park and the River's Edge and the rec center development and the pools were all priority ranked and there's a process in place, but I don't know if there's a way to look at, is there any overlap there? All that to say, who will, before it goes to a vote where we're having eliminations, look at where some of 3 or 4 of these projects could be combined, or at least segments of it combined to be one funding stream, so that we're leveraging what exists in the community and also increasing the synergy that can happen across those projects.
To some degree, you all will be helping do that tonight, and hopefully when we get there, I'll explain possibly how that might be. Because part of it's going to be defining more of what fits into those. If for example, I'll use the Northwest Hub makes its way through, I mean, that's a fairly well thought out project already. So it would be, we would explain kind of exactly what is in that. And then if there are things that were in it that did not make sense to have in one of the other proposals that made sense, we would be explicit about this. In fact, this does not include that piece. Or if there was a desire to actually leverage that same thing in another part of the community, then we would be explicit about saying that piece of it. Yeah, we have a little more description in each of these that we'll get to each of you and stuff. Let me go to Karen and then Mark, and then I'll come over. Trish.
Tim Kaine was here yesterday to observe Overdose Awareness Day with us, and he mentioned that when he was governor, that meth was the big problem, and that he put a lot of things in place with the help of the General Assembly to address meth, overdoses, and addictions. And at the end of the day, he was talking to people, and it made little to no difference. They went from meth to some other substance. And now that he's in the Senate, he's been talking to people about that. What's the one thing, because according to him, legislators all want just one thing. What's the one thing we can do to impact the opioid crisis? And what his answer was, I think is impactful to our work tonight, and that is build community. Look at the root causes. Don't Band-Aid the symptoms. Look at the root causes of why people are using substances and address that. And it is their lack of community. So every decision that we make, I think, will impact substance use, will impact gun violence, can impact the future of our youth and the health of our community if we keep the lens that we want to address the root causes of the ills of our community. So I think that as we look at these projects, we really need to be clear, are we putting all of our eggs into one root cause? Are we spending our money wisely across several of the root causes for the issues that people have? in our community, and keep that in mind as we make our next sets of cuts to our programs or collapsings, as we were talking about.
So I want to say thank you for mentioning that, because I want to second what John had to say about the importance of going for the grocery store right now. And the way that I've been thinking about this, which I think is the way it's generally understood, is that the grocery store is not a standalone entity, but part of a community hub, meaning that people go there to access community services of, whether it's housing, whether it's mental health services, childcare, on, and that brings people to the grocery store and improves its chances of success. And of course, as a hub, it also requires the transportation services and the whole panoply of things that make it attractive to people, as, for example, the Grandin Village neighborhood is.
I agree. Thank you, Bob. I just wanted to say, initially when we started, Bob gave us an overview on the process, and I think it has gotten lost or created some ambiguity, because people are asking about, like Betty Jean was talking about, the process and how will people know when it's time. Bob, if it might be, I know you brought us dinner because you think we're going to be here all night, but I think it might help if you just gave a brief summary on how that works, because there is an application process once we get to that point, and I know you're trying to get to that point, but I think people maybe, and even some of our viewers may not understand how that process is going to work. And you did explain it, but remember, it was so early on that we've gotten so much information since then that it may have gotten lost.
Yeah, and again, it will really vary depending on what makes it on the list. So, again, in some instances, it will be pretty easy, and I'll use my example again of what we did with the clinics. I mean, it was pretty easy to say we wanted to support the low-cost to free health clinics in the community. There are 3 of them. Pretty easy to say, okay, we'll take the money and actually fund it directly to them. There were other projects, and there will be in this, I'm sure, too, which are best reviewed through existing processes that we already have. The Arts Commission, the Health Services, Human Services Advisory Board, some of them have to. Private funding has to go through our EDA because we cannot, as a local government, provide funding directly to private businesses, so it has to go through the EDA. So some of them will go through those processes, and there will be applications and MOUs and all that kind of stuff that accompanies it. Others will be a different process than what we used in CARES, which again is some kind of call for proposals to be able to do pieces of it. It could also be, we did this with the virtual learning centers, where we were not the ones responsible for doing it. It was a combination of United Way, the Boys and Girls Club, as well as the schools themselves and the YMCA. And we simply provided that initiative money, and then they went through the process of vetting who it was that would actually provide the service. They went through the process of managing that service and reporting on it and so on. So it could be any one of those options depending on what ends up making it on this list. And I'm going to take like one more, and then I want to mention something on the grocery store. And then so far you've answered my question by saying everything we heard, let's put it on the list. So we do need to get to a point of where we're saying, okay, what's going to make it on this list? And I'll explain what I handed out to you as well, but I want to kind of touch on that. So, Judy.
Before we vote, I'd like to know if we've already got money or plans for some of these. I know we do for the grocery store. That's going to help me decide that, yes, definitely, I want to do that. Is there private money that's going into this? Because that makes our money even more valuable for that particular project. And I know we've hinted at this, but I don't think we've got our cards out there where I can see what they are, so I know really what I want to vote for.
And that's fair. And as soon as we get the last couple of questions here on this stuff that I just handed out to you, I'm going to run through it, and I think that'll start answering that question. So.
I just want to speak on the duplication of services when we talk about the Melrose Northwest Hub. So the Housing Authority pretty much already has a similar initiative called the Envision Center. And so what it is a one-stop shop where people can access all different types of community services. And it is geared towards people living in public housing, Section 8 residents, but it's also open to the community. Right now it's housed on Salem Turnpike across from Lansdowne. And we try to put it in those type of neighborhoods so people can walk, and it eliminates the transportation barrier for people. So when we look at a hub, something like that already exists. It's been around since 2020, and Roanoke was the first housing authority in Virginia to get this initiative. And it's been called a gold star in Virginia. So we're already doing things that other housing authorities in Virginia are looking at us to do when it comes to this community center.
And
So
it's physically located in the old library.
Yes, it's going to be in the old Melrose Library. Renovations are supposed to be complete in April. And so, again, it's open to the community, but right now it's at Lansdowne. So we partner with TAP, a lot of these services that were mentioned today, Goodwill, Virginia Career Works. We put on home ownership classes. There's a computer lab for people to come in and use. So when you all think about a community center, remember there is something already similar in the area, but there's always a need for more. But you all are more than welcome to partner with us on different initiatives.
All right, Betty Jean, we're going to have you, and then I'm going to jump into this information and move us forward.
Real quick, on our meeting on August 25th, where we were given 3 choices for people and 4 choices for places, when you presented the results, you showed us the priority rank based on count. And now, not to disrupt what you're about to unfold, but with all these pieces laid out, it looks like all the options are exactly equal, and yet on August 25th, there was already a priority. And I want to piggyback off what this woman said here, is that if, to John's point, we're going to try to leverage these funds with known funds or funds to be unfolded, that also, in addition to priority rank, might play a role in first choosing that before we see how it relates to the compliance with ARPA.
Sure. Okay, so yes, and let me answer that. I'm working off memory here, so Angie, you help with your memory. So the project that received, out of all of the 15 or so we had, or I always remember the count, 15, whatever it is, of the ones that ended up kind of off your big list down to the whittled list, the project, and it's really actually fairly easy to say this because about the first 4 projects garnered most of the points, and then it dropped off dramatically. So the initiative that scored the highest was the Northwest Hub with the grocery store. That was the highest. And now my memories, I'm waiting to see if Angie has that, because I did not bring that one piece of paper with me, of course. You took a picture? See? Very good. Because I was going to say the second one was the affordable housing, but I don't want to say this if I got it wrong. So, yep.
So 29 was the grocery store. Next was 21 with affordable housing. And third was 17 votes with the recreation.
And then everything on places after that garnered 3 votes, 4 votes, 6 votes. So it was a pretty dramatic drop-off from those 3. Those are the ones that kind of garnered the highest. The rec center, the affordable housing, and then the Northwest Hub was the ones. I think Gainsborough Hub came in right after that, like with 8 or something votes. On the people side,
on the people side, 19 votes for the workforce skills and development, 18 votes for enhanced mobility. Then it dropped down to 15 for violence interruption, and then after that we went into single digits.
so I mean, it was actually, I mean, the good thing about that was, as a group, you kind of highlight it pretty quickly, the top 3 or 4 on each of those, in each of those categories. And that is relevant as you start to think about kind of what, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to have to take stuff off this list in order, at least off the list for the $64.5 million. You may still say, hey, these are important initiatives. If there's other sources of funding, let's go for those. So let me explain what you have, because we're going to use this to some degree to try to get through this list that we currently have. And I don't want to ignore the question that started that conversation, which was, we may still finish this, and you may still feel as a group something else needs to be considered as we move forward. I'm going to start, since the question's come up a couple of times, and what I've tried to do with this is I have tried to just write kind of a brief paragraph from what either has been talked about or that I know about from the initiatives that you've described, to give a little bit more explanation of what would be involved in this kind of initiative or project. So that's what this is. You can kind of ignore the stuff below that right now, because I'll explain what that is. But I'm going to start with the grocery store. So this is the Northwest Hub initiative that has been identified. This is a project or a hub that has been very long studied for a number of years, very deeply engaged with the community for a number of years. And the result has been a center that is located on about 5 acres of land that is anchored by a grocery store, full-service grocery store, that includes the potential for a health clinic, as well as what I would refer to as kind of micro retail locations. So these are retail spaces that local businesses or vendors or merchants could actually acquire or move into it at low cost associated with it. And Liz, am I missing another piece? Okay, business incubator and a restaurant. So that's all part of it. The city's been a partner in that discussion along the way, and fully anticipated and still anticipates that in order to get a development in that area, it would require some form of city participation through the form of incentives. Typically, what that involves is the city may acquire land and make it available to a developer, and the city may, through the Economic Development Authority, provide some kind of tax rebates. So based off of the taxes that they pay, they receive rebates back on those taxes. The idea is to, again, lower the cost of development so that they would invest in an area that they might not otherwise invest in. And that's where we all kind of went into this and thought we would end up. The most recent study that was done, was just recently completed, indicates, yes, that's necessary in order to get that development in that area. That's necessary. And probably it also requires some kind of operational subsidy for the grocery store, meaning the expectation is that there would be some long-term public involvement in funding that. The reason being is because though market studies were performed for this area that show the store making a profit, the belief in the consultants that were engaged, not by us, but by other parties, engaged in the discussion, the profit's not enough for them to make that investment, that they would want some form of guarantee. I don't know, Liz and I have talked. Liz was involved, Liz orchestrated many of those studies and with the neighborhoods and the community. We've not identified a way in which to close that gap yet. That's the one piece that still remains. So one of my questions as we go through this for you all with the Northwest Hub is going to be a couple of them. John's kind of alluded to one of those. So one question is going to be if those other pieces could be done, because those other pieces would still be private development. So somebody would come in and build a restaurant. We wouldn't. Somebody would come in and build a restaurant. There might be a nonprofit that would come in and operate the incubator, those kinds of things. The health clinic might be one of our health providers would come in and actually operate that. So is that hub still worth pursuing, number one? Number two, is it still rank as high? And then the third is it still appropriate to spend the kind of dollars that are being talked about in there if the grocery store is not a part of it? So that would be one thing to consider. Second piece is, if we pursue going forward, and this is back to John's point, if we pursue going forward saying, yep, it's worth doing, and we certainly hope we should do everything we can to try to land that anchor grocery store, and of course we would, but at what point do we determine that's not going to happen? And then what do we do with the funds? Because the reason that the funds are identified at the level that they are, which is $10 million, in that is because the estimate for the full build-out of that project is somewhere around $34 million, and most of that would be done by private developers, we normally would not participate anywhere near that level in a project. You would normally be participating at 5-7% of the development cost of a project. The thought of putting it in at that 30% number, that $10 million, is that may be a way in which we could then get a developer involved in the subsidy associated with the grocery store. Have no clue whether any of that's possible, because we have yet to find a developer that would be willing to take this project on, and we have yet certainly to find an operator that would be willing to take on a grocery store. So that project has some pretty definitive plans that has already had quite a bit of community engagement. So I started with that one just to give you, since there's been questions about the grocery store. But let me quickly walk through these. And Betty Jean, I think this goes to some of your question, which is, well, what's involved in each of these initiatives to the extent that we can, because that may help then decide, okay, this one is something I would support, or there are opportunities for overlap to combine with another one, or to avoid doing one of them because it's already covered in something else. So. What's that? Oh, sorry. I skipped the whole side. Sorry. So, let me hand these out. Sorry, guys. Probably would make more sense if you had it, wouldn't it? I think there's one on the back, Lauren. All right, so on this, so if you look at the one that starts with people, leadership development, I've mentioned this in, when we gave these descriptions before to some extent, I've mentioned this before, but the city has been involved in an effort that is a partnership between United Way, Carillion, and the National League of Cities. The intent is to try and actually increase the leadership capabilities and capacity in the northwest and southeast parts of our community, so that those neighborhoods can take more ownership in deciding the interventions that are introduced into those neighborhoods to address the disparities in health outcomes. That's what that initiative started at. So what this would entail is it would involve programs that would bring representatives from those neighborhoods together with other experts that are involved in leadership development and training. It would pay the participants, so they would be paid to attend that training. They would be provided those other services that remove barriers, things like transportation, childcare, and so on. And again, the intent is to build really a team, an ongoing, growing team of folks in each of those neighborhoods that, rather than be simply recipients or consumers of what the experts bring into their neighborhood, they would be the drivers of those conversations. So that's what that leadership development program entails, that has been on the list. The job training, skills development, career pathways. Well, let me back up. On that one, there is no other money involved in it. The National League of Cities participation was technical assistance, so we have some pretty high-level experts that are assisting us in that, but that's the extent of the participation. I do think there's a potential to leverage some funding from one of our partners, being Carillion, to assist in financial support of that as we go forward, but they have not committed to that. On the job training, skills development, career pathways, I'll preface this by saying there is one of those federal EDA programs that I mentioned. There is a program out there that is competitive, so there is no guarantee that we would actually secure any of these funds that could be used to leverage this. There's a program, and what that program in real simple terms is, you would assemble employers in our area who are looking for employees, and hopefully these would be in your high growth areas. So think of things like biomedical, healthcare, construction, advanced manufacturing. You would assemble those individuals. Those individuals would identify workforce gaps that they have. You would then also assemble the workforce, the providers of that kind of training and education, community colleges, nonprofits, Build Smart Institute, all of those types of entities that offer that kind of training. You would provide the wraparound services for participants so they could participate in that training, get that skill set, and those businesses that you interacted with in the beginning would actually have agreements to actually hire those individuals, either in the form of internships, assistantships, or upon completion of the training, they get hired and so on. That's the program that's at the federal EDA level. That program can access as much as $500,000 up to $20 million to do that type of work. It does require a match. This potentially could serve as a portion of that local match. Or if we were unsuccessful in an effort of trying to secure those federal dollars, then we would have our own local version of that program, just fund it at a much lower level. But that's what this intention is to be around that particular project. The enhanced mobility, I think Jeremy did a pretty good job of explaining that one, but I'll explain it again. This is an initiative that would do a number of things around increasing mobility in our community that would include increasing the number of shelters at the heavily used transit stops. So many of our most frequently used transit stops don't have shelters. This would be looking at, I'm going to say creative ways, because one of the reasons why we don't have shelters is not necessarily because of money as much as it is because of the difficulties in actually securing the space necessary to put those shelters. So this would be a way in which we could perhaps take some more creative approaches in providing those shelters. That would be part one. It would also look to increase the presence of safe, accessible sidewalks in and around those same kinds of stops to get people from wherever they may be living or wherever they may be shopping to those bus stops or working. So that's another piece of it. And then, of course, we talked about demonstration routes. And those could be inside the city, where we try to expand hours and or frequency. Or they could be to service areas outside the city that we cannot service right now because we don't have participation from the county, but this could cover those expenses. They're demonstration because obviously they would only last as long as this funding project lasts, hopefully then proving concept that we would then be able to secure permanent funding. That's the mobility one. The violence interruption, the way that it's characterized right now, what I've simply done in this case is, as you all know, there's a Gun Violence Prevention Commission, which has been formed by the City Council, and that group has been actively working on a number of different projects associated with it. Of course, law enforcement has actively been working in partnership with the commission on their side of the issue. And there have been a couple of grants that have been secured, including one recently of $500,000. I think there is the opportunity to secure some additional grant funding. I don't know if it'll be quite at that level, but some additional funding. So all I've done in this case is simply say, do more of what they're doing. So basically, these include things like youth mentoring and coaching. It includes trauma-informed training as well as other aspects around that. It includes the anti-gang activities. It includes violence interrupters, additional law enforcement responses, which could include outreach efforts, directed patrols, those types of things. So that's what this one would do. It would basically expand more of what it is that is already underway, and we may, again, be able to leverage some other grant funding to be able to expand that even further. And then I think the last one on people is the local food system expansion and food hub. And you know, Maureen was at the meeting yesterday at the public hearing on Monday, and I think did a pretty good job of explaining this one. But basically, this is, I'm going to keep it real simple here, but this is taking what it is that LEAP currently does. So think of the LEAP mobile food market that makes its routes around the Northwest and other parts of the city. Think of the Grandin Village market. Think of the West End market, and so on. It would take those and scale them up so that they could serve more people in more areas. And on the flip side of it is provide more access to growers, so people who are actually trying to make a living doing this type of thing. That's what that one is intended to do, which is another way to try to address the access to food, or address food insecurity and access to food. So those are the ones that are on your list, right? And well, let me back up too. Maureen has been very successful at securing for LEAP grants on and off, but those grants basically have been able to sustain what they have. They probably cannot scale without some other kind, and there probably is not other funding at this point to be able to do that. Let me shift to the places. So the Gainsboro one we've already talked about, so that's the one that anchored with the grocery store. The Melrose we already talked about. The Gainsboro one, again, you heard folks, Tommy Page spoke on this, Jordan Bell spoke on this, and a couple of others at the meeting. But what this is it is an intent in the Gainsboro area to take a couple of properties and redevelop those properties in a way that actually opens up the possibility of training in the areas of business incubators and business accelerators, entrepreneurship training, those types of things, along with addressing that area's very specific health outcomes. So a bit different in terms of having a health clinic, but something along those lines that are more targeted for that particular community. There, similarly, and actually several of those activities are already underway. So Tommy mentioned that he's already doing a number of those activities currently, but not to the scale at which they ultimately would like to do or could do as they advance forward on that. There is probably, and I'm speculating here, there are probably opportunities to leverage these funds for other funds. I think the area of minority-owned businesses and entrepreneurship are fairly ripe for opportunities out there, but I have no guarantee or, that would occur for certain as we go into this effort. I will tell you that Tommy and others that are involved in it, their end game, all of that's important, getting folks trained, getting businesses more solid and stuff, but his end game, their end game is to act as a catalyst in that area for black ownership, black-owned businesses, black entrepreneurs, black developers. That's their goal. That's what they have shared with us. We have been working with them in some regard for a couple of years, actually trying to advance this particular effort, but that's what's involved, and probably where it differs from the Northwest Hub. The Northwest Hub is really designed to kind of cater and serve to the surrounding population. This hub is really designed to cater to emerging businesses and entrepreneurs within the African American community, and really try to grow that side of the community and the economy.
Just point of information question. Is that, when you say a center located in Gainsborough, are you saying Henry Street or are you saying Gainsborough?
I'm being somewhat non-transparent here, and I apologize for that. And the reason is because we are actually in the middle of conversation regarding land acquisition. And so what I'll say that in historic Gainsborough, so in the historic kind of core of Gainsborough, associated with it. So yeah. Now I will say that even though I'm involved in those discussions right now, that does not, if this did not make the list, we're going to find another way to figure it out. I don't know what that is, but this makes it obviously a lot easier to do as we move forward. Next one is, which one do you have on there? I don't have page numbers, so. Yeah, that's what I didn't know which one. I'm gonna go with the redevelopment of the community rec center because I don't know which side it's on. So the redevelopment of the community rec center. I think we've talked about this before, but basically the city has two community rec centers, Preston and Eureka. Both of those are older than 50 years. Both of them have long outlived their usefulness. They are heavily dependent, or they are heavily involved in providing indoor recreational opportunities for our youth in both of those communities, as well as for the community. Those two rec centers were the #1 projects that came out of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Over the next 5 years, the city has identified some funding in the CIP to address those, but not enough funding to address both of those. Investing ARPA funds in this, very likely at the right level, could actually get both of those rec centers partly funded by CIP. I keep saying CIP, sorry, Capital Improvements Program. That's our budget basically for capital projects. Partly funded by CIP and partly funded by ARPA. The end of that would be an state-of-the-art indoor recreation centers that would, of course, offer basketball, classrooms, other kinds of things. I told Jarrell, it was kind of like Jarrell's Grand Vision light. still top-notch, still quality, but not $60 million project and stuff. But that's what this one is. That's what the rec center piece is. The regional outdoor recreation amenity, we've talked a little bit about this one. As you all know, the things like the greenways, Mill Mountain trails, Carvin's Cove, our mountain bike trails, those are used obviously by our local population, but they are also used very heavily to market this area for tourism, bringing in those economic activities and those economic dollars. And they're used very heavily in the recruitment for folks to come here and work. Those are parts of what we kind of present out there. All of that has been built and relies upon grant funding and volunteers. And frankly, we're falling behind. There are other communities that are advancing on those amenities, and it is part of our competitive edge, part of our brand. So what this project, or there isn't really a project with it, there are several things that could be considered for this. It could be expansion of the greenways. It could be expansion of those other kinds of facilities. There has been conversation, I think somebody mentioned it at the public hearing, about an in-stream kayak route, which basically is inside the Roanoke River at Wasena and at Explore Park. If the county also wanted to put money in for this, there would be features actually built into the stream that actually have offer the opportunities for kayakers. So it's those kinds of amenities would fit within that category. And there is, other than the occasional small grant that might be out there, there really is no other funding that goes toward that effort. We have funded most of the projects that we've had so far through transportation dollars, and that probably has pretty much exhausted its opportunity at this point. That's what most of the greenways were built with. Probably not. So the question was whether it would be under the infrastructure bill. Possibly the greenways would. The other amenities probably not, because the infrastructure bill seems to be focusing very heavily on kind of traditional infrastructure and less so on, I guess, green infrastructure pieces of it. There is a part of that EDA grant, there is a piece of that grant I'm kind of exploring as well to see. It would be, again, highly competitive, but there is a piece of it that's oriented around tourism that maybe would offer an opportunity. The last two are the next phase of River's Edge North Sports Complex. Again, you all know that River's Edge is where we have many of our competitive athletic fields. So these are fields this is one of our regional parks. So this is where we hold our tournaments. There are events and festivals that are held there, and so on. It is a multi-phased development, and we've gotten the first couple of phases done. And eventually in the CIP, in the next 5-10 years, we would move on to the next phases. This would just be simply an opportunity to accelerate the development and construction of that project. And then the last one is the safe and affordable housing. And again, we've safe, affordable, and accessible housing since we changed that. This one we've talked about. This one is, again, designed the way it's been presented here is everything from training for folks that could get equipped and skilled to be involved in housing rehabilitation and housing construction, so that then alongside the other folks that are doing this work would be rehabilitating houses and constructing new houses, all the way from homes that are for sale up to homes that offer transitional and permanent supportive housing for those that are transitioning out of homelessness. This would obviously be really involved deeply with our existing partners that we have in the community that already work in this space, that already provide these kinds of services. So that hopefully, and well, let me back up too. That one probably also, other than kind of your normal fundraising kinds of efforts, probably has no other sources of funding that are currently going toward that. So again, those were the projects and initiatives that you all had identified kind of on the list. I think we now, before we had, I think cost estimates for probably almost every one of them. Now I think we have cost estimates, and they're really loose estimates, but still estimates for each of those. I can tell you that the items that made the list that were in the top like 3 or 4 that we talked about on people, based on the funding that was identified in the kind of the 50-50 split, you could do every one of those. It falls within the category. So the items that we mentioned, the job training, and no, I can't remember what they. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so you had the workforce, the gun violence interruption, and enhanced mobility. Yeah. So you could do those top 3 and still have funding that fits within the funding. It's really the places side. The places side had, if you took like the top 5 that were on there, that exceeded the amount of funding. Now, Jeremy had suggested in an email that went out that, take a look at, does that 50-50 split make sense? That, again, was a placeholder that I had put out there that, we've got 2/3 of the funding that we're moving forward. 15% of which is going over into the governance side of things. So you got 85% of 2/3 of the money that is available. I had simply suggested 50-50 between those two buckets, and then that 80-20 between recovery and resiliency. That may not be the formula that works for you, because ultimately you want to get and forward as recommendations the big lifts that make the most sense to you. And if it makes sense to have more of those or more expensive ones of those on the places side and less funded on the people side, that's fine. Jeremy had even suggested maybe it's more important to put more money in the recovery piece of people, because that's the immediate funding for people, and less important on the places side. So those are things that ultimately you'll kind of need to consider. Yes. Those two alone. Yep. So yes. So a piece of what you'd also have to look at is, remember, the grocery store, if it makes it through the list, the $10 million number is just a number. It represents 1/3 of what we anticipate the cost of that overall project to be. You may not want to fund it at that level. I'll say any funding is more than the funding we have right now, though I think, and I'll come back to this, to John's point, I think you need to have a plan B if you go that route and it doesn't work out. But yes, that's kind of the challenge associated with those more impactful. But again, I think Jeremy also mentioned maybe we're trying to fund too many things, that if an $8 million recreation center has a real impact, then rather than trying to say, well, let's do it and 3 other things, and maybe, well, let's do that. Or if the grocery store project has a real impact, then let's do that. And you just have to kind of strike those balances as you move forward. The next thing I'll say, and then I'll hopefully explain kind of what we can do to sort of move into that discussion. And it goes back to something that Vice Mayor said. Remember, at the very beginning of this, process, I highlighted that there are, in effect, 2 sets of ground rules, I guess. One of those is we have to comply with the Act. We have to comply with the instructions that the Treasury has provided to use these funds. And they're fairly explicit. So let me remind everyone, again, what those... Of course, I don't have the one in front of me that has it. Let me grab my notes. Well, let me read off the one that I do have, which is not the Act. This is the one with the guiding principles. So let me read that first, and then I'll get the ones from the Act itself. So the guiding principles, remember, these were, one, projects that are selected you'll be able to clearly make a linkage that they comply with the Act. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that they further city's objectives as stated in the strategic plan, the comprehensive plan, and other adopted policies. So that's why I mentioned where, for example, the skate park falls in the adopted Parks and Recreation Master Plan, because the city has already defined its priority Parks and Recreation. It doesn't mean the skate park's not important. It just means there have been other projects identified as higher ranking. The third is address known disparities and promote equity and inclusion. So as you think about, okay, which of those projects should get cut? Which of those projects should stay? Do the projects selected address a known disparity, health outcomes, unemployment, unsafe housing, those kinds of disparities that are predominantly borne by people of color, since that's really what we've talked about, that's the group that has been most impacted, along with the elderly, really in our area in terms of COVID. And then outcomes are achievable with a single investment, meaning there is not an ongoing expense unless you have reason to believe that ongoing expense can be covered in some other way that appears to be likely. So that would be one of the other ones. And then, of course, we've all said, has the potential for transformational change. So those have been the guiding principles. So, trying to keep those in mind as we make these sort of cuts. The ones from the Treasury, and I don't have it exactly in front of me, so I'm going to work off of memory here, but one of those is it has to be directly related to COVID, meaning there has to be some demonstrable impact from COVID, either personal, health, economic, something like that. So you can, for example, there obviously have been people who have been unemployed At one point, as many as 12% of our workforce was unemployed as a result of COVID. So obviously, one can make a link between job training and skills development with a COVID impact. One could relate business support for minority businesses or others because there has been a direct link associated. So that's one of the Act's requirements is tied to COVID or its economic impacts. Another is tied to the, you can also pay for premium pay basically for those performing essential services. And it's pretty wide open as to what those essential services are, but you can pay that premium. Another is associated with trying to address, now I'm going to remember, I had this one and I forgot it. And I'll come back to that one in a second. The last one, which is kind of the catch-all with this, is that if it's in a qualified census tract, it really opens up more options. So qualified, and we have several of these in our community. These are census tracts that have deep poverty within the census tract, and if you are making investments in those areas, there is a presumption of benefit. So effectively, what it means is the people in that area will benefit from that expenditure, which is permissible under the Act, with a few exceptions, and I'll explain those in just a moment. But so that, you still have to, it should be used to address, it says things like the social determinants of health. So think of things like people have poor health outcomes because they don't have access to safe housing. They don't have access to safe, reliable food. They don't have access to good transportation. They don't have access to recreation. All of those contribute to health outcomes. Those would all be eligible inside a qualified census tract. The other one in the Act was lost revenue. So you can, as a municipality, I'll tell you, we've run the numbers already. So we could, your city council, could account for $28 million of lost revenue in the first year alone. We haven't yet done the calculations for the second year or the third year. What a lot of communities are doing is they're claiming that $28 million and they're putting it in the general fund. It's not going to these kinds of efforts. It's just going to balance the budget. The council has opted not to do that. We balanced the budget without relying on the funding coming from this program. But that's one of the eligible activities you can. Now, you'll notice in our governance section, we are talking about claiming some of that so that we can use it for capital investments associated with our, for example, our parking operations, which lost revenue. But we're using it within this framework. We're not actually just taking it off the top and saying, okay, that's claimed. But that's the other thing that the Act will require. So I say all of those things to say, as we work our way through sort of whittling down this list, if you will, keep those things in mind, because ultimately those are sort of your guardrails. Those are, because obviously if we select an initiative that is in violation or not clearly eligible under the Act, we can't fund it. It's going to get kicked out. And hopefully, if you look at it and say, it really doesn't address a disparity, or I can't identify one, and it really doesn't it doesn't improve on some of these other items, then, it's probably not. Maybe it's a good project. It's just not as worthy for these dollars as is another project. So what I had on this sheet was one of the exercises I had contemplated possibly going through to kind of help us with this was, looking at kind of that first question, which is, do any of these initiatives not clearly align with the Act? And if they do, it needs to be eliminated because it can't be funded. And then the next one was really looking at those guiding principles that I mentioned and saying, okay, does it address all of those guiding principles? Does it address a couple of them? Because again, you've got to at some point start to kind of rank order these even more so than you had done before. The other option you have is if you feel like the listing we already gave you is still sufficient. Remember, you already have kind of done this. If you didn't want to add really anything that came out of the public hearing, you've already said number 1 in places was the Northwest Hub with the grocery store. Number 2 in places, affordable. No, those are backwards. Okay, sorry. So affordable housing, and then the rec center, and then if I took it down below that, I think it was Gainsborough was next. Is that right? somewhere I have them written down too, so. Right. So, I mean, that's the other way you could do is say, you know, hey, one, do all of those seem, you still have to ask the question, are they eligible under the Act? But then you could just simply say, you know what, that's still the order, that's still the rank order. Then you're going to have to figure out, okay, if that's the case, that adds up to more money than what you so far have designated to go into the places category. So either you decide we're not going to dedicate $10 million to the grocery store hub, or we're going to actually dedicate less money to the resiliency ones over on the people side and dedicate more money onto the places side. So that's another option that you have. So really, I'm kind of open to what way you all feel most comfortable about evaluating, because again, I did the math earlier today, and you know, there's probably $20 million worth, $20 million more of priority items than there is funding. And so, and so at some point we've got to start making decisions as to, okay, which of these on the resiliency side move forward in both of those categories. You want to give Liz? Thank you.
I have a question and a potential suggestion. My question, as I'm looking at compliance with the Act, and this just may be because the others are so glaringly obvious, it's easy, but can you help me understand better how some of those recreation facilities comply with the Act? And then my potential suggestion, the 50-50 split was hard for me, so maybe 2 meetings ago I ran through the numbers after you gave us some earmarked ideas, and to me it broke down to a more like a 20%, 60% split after you'd removed governance out of there. I think infrastructure is just a lot more expensive than services for individuals. Yep. So I would recommend we push a little bit more into the places category.
So let me say I'll start with the recreation centers. So the recreation centers, I think, are aligned with the Act in probably 2 ways. One of those is they are both in qualified census tracts. And therefore, investment in, obviously, rec centers that cater predominantly to youth in an area known to have poor health outcomes, that have life expectancies that are much lower than elsewhere, would itself do that. The other way it would comply, even if it weren't in that, I think because recreation has been demonstrated to be effectively a necessity in the way in which, especially outdoor, but including indoor, in a way in which to actually address and respond to COVID and so on. So I think you could even qualify it under that. So that's the rec centers. The larger kind of regional, I think, fall into the area in our community, probably the area economically that was hit the most, had suffered the most, was in tourism and hospitality. And so the area, think about all the hotels that were closed, weren't taking folks in, no one was traveling, and so on. And so certainly that's probably our economic sector that suffered the most. And so arguably, I think by investing in something tied to the economics around tourism would certainly qualify under that piece. It would not probably be in a qualified census tract, but it would probably qualify under that. River's Edge is a little bit trickier. You know, you could possibly make that argument, but I think it's probably harder to stretch that argument than it would be the regional one. So if there was one of those that I would say might be questionable on the Act, I would say it's probably that one as to whether it really could meet that or not. So the question was if there's money for violence interruption coming from the federal government. Not really. The White House was very clear that even though the Act didn't specifically identify gun violence as a legitimate, if you will, expense under this, they made it very clear it is under the ARPA Act. Statewide, the governor and the General Assembly have dedicated a little bit of their ARPA and maybe their surplus funds to go to grants. I think it's $2.5 million available to about 7 or 8 communities. That's where we've actually secured once the $500,000 grant, and I think we could secure a little bit more from that, but that'll be the limit on it.
Over here.
So you've eliminated possibly one, which may not be aligned with the act, which is that River's Edge north. It may be too big of a stretch to include that one. Karen?
Yeah, I would be in favor. It feels like we've already done this, the ranking, and so just personally, I would be in favor of just keeping the ranking as it came out last time. But I would be in favor of perhaps taking a look at the allocations and making it a little more equitable so that the funds could be, it's real heavy on the places in terms of funding that's needed. So I think we should take, and I'm not quite sure how the amounts, projections on the costs were developed, but I think that might be helpful for me just to know, how do we come up with those figures?
Yeah, and some of them are more real than others, is how I would describe it. So there's a few, the grocery store is a good example where, we have a fairly well-defined market study and pro forma attached with the development costs associated with that, which was like $34 million. And so the $10 million number was just a kind of guesstimate as to what might make a difference in making that project happen. But that's how that one sort of came about. But the other ones, like you may remember, like the violence interruption, I had in there kind of a range of $1 to $3 million. So it really just matters in that case, since we're just talking about doing more of what we're already investing in. It may be, okay, well, is that $1 million more, or is that $3 million more? So that one's just kind of a little more open. A few of these are a little more developed than others because there were proposals behind them. But other ones really are kind of, this is the amount of money that you could put toward that effort. If you follow along with, and I'm going to grab a mic down here, but if you follow along with what Karen was saying, again, what that would mean basically is if you could fund the ones that were listed for people, you could fund the top 4, I think it was 4 or 5 of those, and still have money left that you could apply into the places category. You could also decide that you don't want to invest as much in the recovery piece of either one of those and apply it to the big lifts associated with that side of it. Because remember, in the people side, you have $3.6 million dedicated to recovery, and basically $3.6 million also to recovery on places. So you could also alternate that. Who's got a mic over there?
And I was looking at the redevelopment of the community recreation center, which has gotten a lot of support. And I was thinking about the kids that came about the skate park, and wondered if there'd be an opportunity to offer them some choice and say, you can wait on Wasena. That felt a little like maybe it'll happen one day, or maybe we could include it in Preston Park. And put it there and give them some choice about that?
I've got 2 thoughts on that maybe. One of them is that they've been in that process. That process resulted in the choice of Wasena. That was the process. They were involved in it along with the rest of the community. We may also be able, if we actually are able to identify enough funding through this effort to fund the recreation center, and possibly 2 recreation centers. There is some money in the capital improvements program out a couple of years from now that we could actually then program. It would free up those dollars potentially to program those dollars for the skate park. So that may be another way to go at the skate park. Because if you already kind of chip away at the recreation center, since those were the top ones, there may be a way in actually using some of our local funds to go for that skate park piece. That might be another option associated. It still would go in Wasena, and it would still be 2 to 3 years from now, but it still has to be designed. It's not even designed. It's just gone through the feasibility part of it. So maybe you could do the design in the next year or 2 and then be positioned to actually construct it as the bridge is wrapping up. That may be another way, using our CIP dollars, if those CIP dollars are freed up by funding the rec centers out of this effort. That might be a way in which to do that.
Thanks. I love so many of these projects, as I think we all do. I will say for the record, I am all in full fan of a Melrose grocery store. I am deeply in love with that project. But I love many of the projects. We'll say 85% of these projects. I would love to do all of them. They feel very blue sky to me. And I think that this moment and this opportunity for blue sky is so exciting, which is why we're spending our conversation here. I'm still looking at recovery, and I'm wondering if we are getting ahead of ourselves. I think about our school kids right now. I'm thinking about, we talk so much about the vaccination rates. I know I said that at our very first meeting. To me, the only way out of this is vaccination rates, full stop. So I would just ask the question, for the 20/80 split between the two, do we feel that we have everything we need in recovery to do that foundational work first before we get to the blue sky?
Yeah, and part of that is to figure out how much is enough to do that. There is in terms of vaccination, in terms of running clinics, in terms of promotion of vaccines and those types of things, there is a significant amount of the state ARPA funding that is going toward that effort. Because remember, the response is predominantly from the state through the Department of Health. We have supplemented that through things like bilingual outreach and actually helping stand up some of the centers. And I do believe that as long as there is some funding left in one of these categories, in the recovery side, dedicated to focusing on testing, contact tracing, and vaccines, including outreach and so on, as long as there's some of that left in there, I do believe there's enough to cover that. However, that is part of the reason why we're also holding back a piece of this money, because who knows what lies ahead, and it may indeed cause us to have to pivot a bit more, and that's a part of the reason to retain some of those funds, because we may find ourselves a year from now having to deal with something very different than what we're dealing with right now, and certainly would not want to find ourselves without the funds to be able to do that. So we've got a suggestion of, all right, well, let's use the rankings we already had, and let's hit those. So yeah, at least to start off with that, because you're still going to have to draw a line somewhere. There's a line in there at some point, and so that had. See, I never have them in front of me. So, in the people one, Angie, you had those, because I'll give you the dollars, because we're going to start on the dollar side now. So, because I want to make sure I get these in rank order. So. The one piece of paper I didn't bring. So.
Is it people?
Yeah, people.
So that was Workforce Skills and Development Pathways Initiative, and that was $3 million plus.
Yep. So that was your number out of the people. That was the one that garnered the number one slot.
Number 2 was Enhanced Mobility at $3 million. And then number 3 was Violence Interruption Initiatives, $1 to $3 million.
Yeah. And what was number 4, Angie? I know we chose 3 in that one, but since that one has some flex, I want to.
So number 4 was Food Systems Food Hub, and that was
2.5 million. That was not in our original, but when Maureen got up and talked, that was the number they were using was 2.5 million. What's that? That one was LEAP, but we wouldn't necessarily use LEAP. It was just we would go through that. Yeah. Oh, the leader? Okay. Yeah. So we had leadership as number 4.
Right. So let me clarify. There's actually 2 number 9s, so that they tied. So that was support leadership development. So that tied with food systems, both at 9. So that was 1 million for leadership.
Okay. So, you could, again, depending on where you draw that line, if you picked the top 3, which I think was what originally was kind of the instructions with that one, those top 3 range somewhere between $7 and $9 million, depending on how much you dedicate to gun violence intervention. So you either could say, okay, that's $7 and $9 million. We have actually, under the 50-50 split, we have almost $15 million. You could take the remainder of that funding and slide it over to places, or you could say, no, we do want to fund that leadership one, or we want to fund gun violence at a higher level and use more of those dollars. So hold that thought. Right, that'll be a piece. So the question that came up earlier was, is there also the desire, once you settle out kind of where those lines are, do you want to adjust that up or down so that you free up some funding to be able to actually solicit specific requests from the community directly, rather than, filtered through this process? So keep that in mind, because as we get into those final numbers, so let me hold that thought, because you've identified kind of those 3 to 4. So let's move back to places, because this is where the bigger decisions are going to have to be made. So I know number 1 was the Northwest Hub, which again right now is identified as the $10 million. No magic to that number. That's just the number that we've used as a way in which to kind of try to incentivize that piece.
And number 2 was affordable and safe housing, and that was $1 to $4 million.
And so that range really was from something as simple as providing funding to somebody like the land bank to go buy some of the lots and redevelop them, all the way up to the full spectrum of what we talked about: job training, land bank, rehabilitation, housing, new housing. So that, depending on what you want to try to acquire or buy with that, that's what that range is. Number 3.
That was with 17 votes, and that was a recreation center for $5 to $8 million.
Okay, so you've got 16 million up to 22 million total, depending on which range you use with that. So I say all that to say you could. Now, we're not doing anything with Gainsborough then. Under that scenario, the next one was Gainsborough, I think. So.
Right. The next one was Gainsborough at $3 to $5 million.
Yep. Those don't include the pools. That's actually, basically, that's one rec center. The $8 million is one rec center. Yeah. No, the need is for 2 rec centers and 2 pools. The $8 million is for 1 rec center. I have some funding in the capital improvements program right now to go toward that project, which either could then go to try and actually advance on the skate park, or you could fund it at 5, and then I'd have to pick the rest up the capital, and that wouldn't leave nothing then for trying to advance on the skate park. So. Yeah, so the ones that did not make that cut, maybe this isn't a way to do it too, that, clearly falling out of that is the, the regional outdoor recreation facility, the River's Edge, really are, if you will, below the line, because even if you shifted stuff over from the people, you're really doing it to fund some part of those other 4 that you've identified. Do I have what? Well, I mean, the dollar amounts will matter in the sense of, how, if you're, that'll tell you how far you want to go on the people side as to how far you can advance on the places side of it as well.
I just want to make sure I'm clear, and I don't know how many other people need this, but between the 2 categories, people and places, how many total dollars do we have available to allocate?
Yeah, so you've got, right now, there's $28 million in the resiliency side of things. So $28 million has been identified for resiliency projects between those two categories. You also, though, have about $7.2 million between those two categories for recovery. So again, you can alter those. Those are based off that 50-50 split and the 80-20 split. So I mean, you can alter those however ultimately you choose. So correct, yeah. The recovery are really those things that are smaller projects that you can immediately get out into the community. Those are things like assistance in paying bills for those that remain unemployed. They're rental assistance. They are getting money out for vaccine clinics, those kinds of things. Those are the short-term, fast, smaller dollar. The resiliency are the much larger, kind of long-term, more transformational kinds of projects. It's a little more than that. It's a little because we got currently we have 32 million in there. We're actually in this stage talking about 40-something million, but remember 15% is over there on the governance side. So but yes, I mean, that's another factor in this is, we're going to program actually more money than we have in the bank right now. But the assumption is that just means as soon as that other money comes in, we already know how we're going to spend the first dollars associated with it out of these programs as we go in. Correct. So there's $28 million right now in resiliency between those two buckets, and there's $7.2 million in recovery between those two buckets.
What happens to the interest on this money? Where is that being put?
We're earning it. I don't know it probably at horrible rates, but and it'll get rolled back into this. So that'll be a part of what we'll calculate at some point. I don't know what, hopefully the interest earned on $32 million is pretty good, but you're probably getting it at horrible rates as we go through. But yes, it'll get rolled into this as well.
Is it time to make a suggestion?
I'm ready.
Okay. All right, I've looked through all of these, and if we added all of them up and spent only $5 million rather than $10 million on the Melrose Hub, that would put us at $33 million. And that seems reasonable to me for this. Do we have to spend 28? Is that the maximum we can spend?
No. Remember, it's really 28 plus the 7.2.
Okay.
So those are the pieces you have between the two, basically between recovery and resiliency.
So I figured out for the $2.5 million for the LEAP project, I put 3. For the Gainsborough Hub, I think I put 5. For Melrose, 5. So anyway, it all added up to 33 if we did the maximum and put $5 million rather than 4 on affordable housing.
Yeah, Marie, you'll have to run through those again so that I. So if you go to the section with the people first, so you can kind of itemize.
Okay, let's see. Okay, for leadership, 1. For job training, 3. For enhanced mobility, 3. For violence interruption, 3. Is that all the people?
There was the food system.
I put 3, just to make it easy.
So in that case, then that totals up to 13 million, if I've done my math right.
Right. And then places, 5 for Gainsborough, 5 for Melrose, 5 for affordable housing, and 5 for the community center.
So that's 20 million, right?
I came up with 33, but maybe I added wrong.
It would be, yeah, it would be 33 million, and then I presume, and again, we want to open this up to everybody, but if you went that route, that would then leave the remainder to go to recovery projects. Then the question would be, is that just, do you put most of that recovery toward people? Those initiatives that would go toward people, is there, do you want to split it between those? Trish, you got it.
Bob, I just want to get recentered again. I kind of got lost in what we're doing. Are you asking us to give you some idea on how to allocate the money, or are you asking us to identify the projects? Because that's two different things.
Yeah,
and I think we're kind of putting the cart before the horse at this point.
They're both kind of, at this point with the discussion, I'd say they're both very intertwined, because in effect, you either stick with the 50-50 split and draw the line, or you basically say, these are the projects that we want to fund, and we allocate the dollars around those funding opportunities. So, right, and so if you took that route, then, and if there was consensus around those that Marie just identified, effectively what you'd be saying is you would fund those projects that were just identified. That would dedicate $33 million to that effort, and then the remaining dollars would go toward recovery projects, because those are all resiliency projects. And the recovery projects are those short-term, kind of more immediate types of things. And again, we'd have to decide, is that equally allocated between people and places and those kinds of initiatives or not? Yeah, or you could put that out. The only downside of that is that will take time, but that would be the only downside of it. But you could say, okay, that's the funding you would use for the idea of saying, let's present out to the community ideas. Now, you could, though, present out to the community and say you're looking for recovery ideas, not these longer-term, big lift kinds of things, but actually quicker fixes in that area. But that, again, that's up to kind of how you all want to do it. But in case anybody's wondering, this is actually how sausages are made. So this is this is that process. Karen.
Yeah, I like Marie's idea. I agree that that's a great way to divide it up, at least in my opinion. And in terms of recovery, I'd be open to, half and half, or since the bulk of the funding is going to the places, maybe giving the people side all of the recovery funds. But Marie, I like your idea for the dividing of the resiliency.
Anyone else? Any thoughts regarding that?
If the mobility piece stays, I'd also like to recognize children walking to bus stops need sidewalks. You have, I think, sidewalks to adult bus stops, but I see many children walking on the side of the road to get to bus stops. So I think that's also an area of priority.
Thank you, and I will make that note. So let me ask this question. Let me ask this question in a different way. First, I'll say what these projects are again. So right now, we've got on the people side, we have the violence interruption for $3 million, the workforce training development for $3 million, the leadership development $1 million, the mobility for $3 million, and the food system $3 million. On the places side, we've got the Gainsborough hub for $5 million, affordable and safe and accessible housing for $5 million, the recreation center for $5 million, and the Northwest hub for $5 million. The remainder going into recovery. So of those, I'll ask this question differently. Is there anyone here that opposes that allotment? Yeah, it was $5 million. Yep. So there's two of you. So, Mr. Lee. Yes, those that I just read off. Whether there's disagreement with those.
Yeah, Bob, my issue is not so much disagreeing to disagree. I just don't know how you can arbitrarily state $5 million. I just don't, so I'm lost. So if I allocate $5 million one place and take it from another, does that cause Melrose Hub to suffer when Gainesboro doesn't need 5 million? I don't know. So I'm sitting here.
So let me try to give a little bit of clarity to those two. So I'll use the Northwest. So the Northwest project to advance is going to require land acquisition. You can probably assume $1 million plus to buy the land. It's going to require our sort of what I'm going to call our typical incentives. That means we would get involved to overcome extraordinary development costs. So let's say utilities have to be extended, demolition might have to occur, what have you. That could be another $2 to $3 million. Then it would be whatever other incentives. So you're already at $4 to $5 million at that point. The other incentives are really operational incentives, which we've not necessarily factored into it. The idea of the $10 million was to see if that was a way in which you could entice a developer into the project that would help cover those operational subsidies. The Gainesboro hub will require, similarly, land acquisition, which could be another $1 million. It will require quite possibly redevelopment or rehabilitation, which could easily be $2 million. And it will require initial programming for the activities that we've talked about. So that's how we've arrived at kind of that $5 million number in those instances. So I feel like in the Gainesboro case, that $5 million number is pretty solid. The Northwest one is shaky. I don't know what it takes to make that project happen because we've been trying to figure out how to make that project happen for 3 years. And it's not an issue of development, it's an issue of operations, and that's the problem is I don't know how to I don't know what level of funding it takes to overcome the operational issues with it. So I can't completely answer the question of, is that at 10 million or 5 million or 2 million because I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and guys, I would recommend that we're getting really into the nitty-gritty here when it comes down to the dollars and the cents. I would recommend that we focus on the higher level, which is the recommendation that we're making to the council, and let them determine how the money gets allocated. Because if we say, hey, this is the #1 priority, then they can figure it out. That's not what we're here for.
That's true. I mean, to some degree, if we know this works to some degree, it's just whether to what degree. But Liz, you want to, since Liz you were the other one that raised your hand about objecting, so.
I think my perspective on our charge was that this was, funding our buckets was something we were responsible for. So what I don't understand is in that breakdown, we're actually allocating more to housing than was recommended?
That was Marie's suggestion, right?
And so to stay within the suggestions, my recommendation would to keep the housing allocation right in the middle of what was recommended and put it at 3. I recommend we keep the Northwest Grocery Store Hub at 10. I really worry about our ability to attract a developer at anything less than that. I've been heavily involved in that project for the last 5 years. The two problems we have are finding a developer and finding an operator. We need a developer in order for an operator to feel confident enough that this project is sustainable for generations to come. I think if that goes below 8, it's not worth funding at all. That's my opinion. So I put the grocery store at 10, housing at 3, the rec center at 5, and Gainesboro at 3. And that puts us at 21 for places. But I just didn't understand going over the recommended allocation for housing there.
All right, so that is a sort of modified proposal, which again puts all the people ones stay the same as what I indicated earlier under this one. It would change the Gainesboro hub to 3 million, which again, I've explained kind of what would go into that. What that probably would affect, I think, is probably the programming piece of it, which would mean in order to get the programming support that would be needed, we would have to seek funding elsewhere, I think, for that piece. But it could probably take care of whatever capital needs there might be in doing it. The housing at 3, the rec center at 5, and the Northwest hub at 10 is what that lays out. So,
Betty Jean.
Two suggestions. One, having the 5 for Gainesboro and 5 for Melrose Hub, paying attention to what Pastor Lee said and what you were saying down here. This is what I was talking about with overlap, that we're talking about essentially a 24-block area. having $10 million invested in 24 blocks. And I'm at a distance, albeit, looking at, there's a great deal of synergy that can happen, that combined money could be used across 2 locations. Despite what you were saying about the acquisition, the operational costs of stand-up, there may be a way to look for, eliminate the waste, the duplication, look for synergy, look for leverage. That's one possibility. The second is, with due respect, I live in Northwest, and I have a lot of neighbors and colleagues that live in Northwest, and we already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, by my count, grocery stores in Northwest. Aldi's, Kroger's, Sam's Club, Walmart, BJ's.
Okay.
And if I can just finish, the challenge with grocery stores and their profit margins is that actually in the last 5 years, low-cost providers have basically cornered the market. They're putting pressure on traditional grocers. And if we bring in an independent, traditional grocer, I fear, will not be able to compete against the 5 grocery stores that are already in Northwest. And I don't know, not having fully read the beautiful presentation, I don't know what proportion of the people we're trying to attract to the Northwest grocery store are already shopping at 1 or more of these 5 locations. So, and is there a way to fund them in terms of transit? I'm just saying, there's a lot going on there.
The market study that was performed for the grocery indicated that there is a certain amount of funding or a certain amount of revenue that could come from a new grocer that isn't captured already currently. It yields a nominal profit margin, and that's been the hang-up in terms of the operations piece, which is this belief that it doesn't yield enough that someone is going to come in without some kind of operational subsidy. What that level is, we have no idea, because so far there hasn't been an operator, and if the grocery makes it, I'm going to come back to a second piece of that, which is my very, very original thing I said about the grocery, which is, okay, so is that Northwest hub worth doing if the grocery is not there? And what's plan B? And when do you cut off? Because if $10 million or $5 million is sitting there dedicated to that, and we can't find ourselves 20 months from now having made no progress on it, we have to have a plan B and a point at which we'd say, okay, we tried that piece. What might have to be next if we can't make that happen? Right. Yeah. And we just had to pick kind of timing for that and stuff. Marie?
My question is, why do we need a health center in Melrose when we have Horizons Healthcare right on Melrose?
I think the items that are listed in there are the items that came out of the process involving the neighborhood. That really is why those are included in there. Now, I will say, inside that process, it is designed to be a multi-phase development, the first phase being the grocer. And so there is the possibility that if you could land a grocer, the other pieces may not make sense for whatever reason. Stuff. But that's why those are in there, is because they came out of the public process that actually formulated what would go into the grocery or into that hub.
I am in agreement with the gentleman with the mask. So many of these things that we're trying to allocate funds for or give percentages for, we do not have enough data to adequately give you the information that you're looking for. In my opinion, we have already defined what is needed. I think these other things are moot issues right now because we're just trying to throw some money at a project or initiative. And when you talk about $5 million, $5 million does not go very far on some of the things that you are intending on doing, whether you have funds or not from another partner. Secondly, when this whole process started out, and it was talking about the different hubs in the Northwest in need of a grocery store. Yes, there is a grocery store at Kroger's. Yes, there is BJ's. Yes, there are these other things. However, in the areas that they are needed, where you have elderly people who do not have means to go there, there are grocery stores in their areas that they live in. No, I do not live on all of these areas, but yes, I have visited. I've grown up in there. That's been my neighborhood. So I do know that in those neighborhoods, there is some type of store. When they are able to go to this store, instead of being charged $1 for something that you may get at Sam's, BJ's, or a larger brand, they're paying $3 and $4. They don't have any money. They need something there that is equitable, where they're not being gouged, where they're not being all of these other things. So if you think about it and put yourself in their position, you would see the need. A lot of them do not have transportation. They can't get to, and if they do have transportation, it's going to take them an hour or so just to take a bus, if it comes in that area, to go to Kroger's. So I think a lot of these things, we're far removed from them, so you cannot identify with them. But in order to be equitable for some people, we have to really consider where they are and what their need is. They have voiced their need, and I do believe that we should listen to what they are saying, what their need is. They know what their need is, and we can't assume. So I do believe this other thing about putting 5, 6, 7 million of it, you don't have enough information to tell you, yes, that is needed. So I think that part needs to be tabled and let the people who have done the feasibility studies, who are in some of these conversations, we don't know what these other conversations behind these doors or these other places are. So my thing is, the ones who have these qualifications to actually know what is needed, hear what they are saying, give them the opportunity to present it to, and so you don't be doing a blind this and a blind that, and then have to turn around and come back to it again, and then it still becomes another discussion, and you don't get anywhere. So I think this does need to be tabled.
And maybe I can follow up kind of on that piece and see if this works. And let me say one thing with the grocery piece before I do this. The council's not going to decide whether the grocery store goes there or how much money goes to it. The neighborhood is not going to decide that. I'm not going to decide it. The private sector is going to ultimately decide it. The government doesn't provide grocery stores. What we can provide are incentives in order to overcome that market failure that's not delivering that grocery store right now. No matter how much money we identify in this, if the private sector still will not deliver that service, it will not go here. So in some ways I agree that it probably doesn't matter a whole lot how much we put in this piece, but it also doesn't matter. We can have people stand up all day long at the podium saying what the preferences of the neighborhood are and what the pro forma says. It doesn't matter if we can't actually land a developer and an operator. So that'll be really what ultimately drives this. So let me see if this will work then, so that we can hopefully put this piece to bed. So we really seem to have complete agreement around the people items. So that basically allocated about 13 million of the dollars that we have in those resiliency. So leave that one kind of where it is. We also have agreement in what the priorities are in the places. I don't think anyone is disagreeing that the top priorities are the Northwest Hub, the Rec Center, affordable, safe housing, and the Gainsboro Hub. What is still not settled out is how much money to put to each of those. That's fine. What we'll do is we'll just simply say, take the resiliency at this point. We'll say, okay, we've got the people place. Take the other, whatever leftover funding, if you will, allocate it over to the places. Those are the priorities. Those are the priorities that you recommend to council. Council can then at that point decide, is that funded at what level? That will ultimately need to be their decision based off of these conversations and off of the other information that we can provide them as we move into that decision making. So that way we don't get wrapped up in that piece. The question, I guess, tied to that is, we similarly could say, okay, is any of the recovery funding going to be also made available, or we just say, just leave the recovery funding where it is, and we move those dollars only out of the side that's on the people side, but we can actually kind of move away from the discussion. We all know those are the 4 priority place projects, and there is at least, whatever the dollar amount, there's at least $15-16 million already identified for that. And then council can ultimately decide, do they want to shift any of the otherwise what would be taken on recovery into any of those categories? I mean, if that makes some sense, because there's really no disagreement in what the 4 projects are. It's just how much money goes toward those. And I think y'all are right. I mean, to some degree, we're just playing with numbers anyway, because we really don't know what it's going to take, because we know it's going to take more than what we've got right now. So.
That's sort of what I was gonna say, and I'm certainly invested in this process, and I'm sure many other people here are. So at a later date, once we have more information, maybe there's a places advisory committee, and we come and we hear more concrete information about what's possible, and then we can make some more, then we can advise some more. But I think at this point, you're right, it's very difficult to do with the information we have available.
I think that at one time we had talked about moving some money out of people, and I think that I'm a little concerned that the lowest priorities in people were pretty low that made the cut. I think it was 9 people maybe. And we're talking about funding them at a fairly significant amount of money and cutting funding out of other things that had higher ratings into that were at places. So I'm wondering if, again, that maybe we need to think about these are the priorities. We've identified them. This is the buckets of money. Maybe we look at 70-30, whatever it is, and maybe we leave it at that, because I still believe that those lowest ranking people projects were not as we did not, when we voted on them, they were not as impactful, we did not see, as some of those other places thing. So I think we've got we're looking at them in a false way, kind of, a false structure.
So under that scenario, that would be similar to what we did with the CARES Act funding. What we basically did was we said, okay, these are our top 5 priorities in people, these are our top 4 priorities in places, and we've got, in this case, in people, we've got, whatever it is, $21 million, and we've got $21 million over here. Council, those are our priorities. You allocate the funding. I mean, that's how that scenario would basically work. And that's how we did the CARES. I mean, in the CARES Act, we did not get down to this kind of level. We basically just said, we want to do stuff that's tied to community safety, and we want to spend 20% of the money to community safety on these kinds of projects. That's what we ultimately did on those. And then the staff and the council worked together to identify the specific amounts that went into those categories. That was how we actually did the CARES Act funding. So, yep.
I just have a rudimentary question. Should we be including a Plan B for the places, since we were talking about that?
Yes. I mean, I think that if those are our 4 priorities, and some amount of money is going to go to at least the Northwest Hub, which has a significant unknown attached to it versus the others. If that project does not pan out, then do we just simply move to the next priority, or do we fund any of those other items at a higher level? I mean, that is a real possibility that might be the case, and it's a substantial amount of funding that would go toward that Northwest Hub. So again, that's a question ultimately for you all, because there does need to be, or do you say if it gets to that point, council's going to make that decision?
I think that's where I was going with my next point, is that we started out with recommendations. So I just want to remind everybody that these are recommendations. And so I don't want us to spin our wheels or spend so much time going back and forth, because they are recommendations, and they could and might be modified when council and the other and staff has their discussion.
So I want to make sure then, because I think we're getting to the point where we can wrap this up, but I want to be certain. So right now, again, we're saying we've got these priorities. There's 9 of them that you've identified. We will provide those in rank order of what those 9 were in each of the categories. We've got a certain amount of money available for the council to allocate based off your recommendations toward those 9. We've got some sense, and we'll certainly be able to provide them maybe more information, but we've got some sense of what each of those could potentially cost, and then they'll make the decision. At that point, so what you're recommending is 9, these are the 9 priority projects. We've got basically 85% of the 2/3 of the money recommended to go toward those 9 projects, plus whatever would be appropriate in the immediate recovery kinds of items, which will still provide illustrative examples. There'll still be examples of the kinds of things that could be funded. Council then would make the determination as to, do they concur with those 9 projects, and if so, how much do they want to fund toward each of those 9 projects as they move forward, and how much do they want to fund toward the recovery projects that would go on as well? Is there anyone that disagrees with that approach? As it gets later, people disagree less, right? Bill? Yeah.
Mr. Kyle, I have no disagreement. I just have this ongoing concern I've had for years, is how we communicate this to the public. Some people think that $10 million mean you will have a grocery store, you will have a hub. I think we need to make sure that people understand that this money is to help look at the feasibility and the investment. It doesn't guarantee anything. And that, I know it's painful, but we have to make sure that people know that, because I don't want to hear from people from Gainesboro come back fussing again and say, see, look what y'all have done. Because the assumption be, if you told me $5 million, then something's supposed to happen. The something may be another process, land bought but no building built. So please make sure people understand that. And I think
I couldn't agree with you more. I have to admit, and the staff knows this, that when I saw the grocery come to the top of this list, I cringed, because so much energy and so much effort has been built in the community, recognizing the very real need. And I also know how far we are away from getting a grocery store on that site. And so, but what this represents, to your point, Bill, is what we can convey is this is potentially the best shot we've had in a very long time to try to see if we can make this happen. But it may not happen for a variety of reasons. And I think communicating that will be really critical, along with, there's also a point at which we say, we've tried, now we've got to put those dollars to another purpose that is similarly identified as a high-ranking kind of thing. And I agree completely. And I don't want to just pick on that one, because some of these other ones could happen in that same way. There may be others that just don't pan out for some reason, and the way we message that is going to be really critical. Jarrell?
Hey, Bob, what you're saying, it goes with what Dr. Lee just said, but it segues well with my thoughts. I was wondering, because I noticed several times it was stated that there's a possibility that it may not work, and if it does not work, we'll take the money and then we will, rechannel it to somewhere else. I was just wondering, what is the stopping point? When do we meet the actual place to say, okay, this is not working? And more than that, how much of the funds are actually going to be used until we get to a place where we say, okay, it's not going to happen? Just a thought, because I keep hearing that over and over and over. So what's the indicator? How do we know?
That's a very legitimate question, and so that's part of why I asked, and I'll ask this again. So first steps in that process would likely be land acquisition. So that would be kind of part one. Second step in that process will certainly be along the way trying to land a developer, trying to land and I say land acquisition, probably we would simply secure some kind of option on the property and then try to see if, based off of an RFP, we could secure a developer and operator. You could end it at that point. You could say at the end of that process, if you do not, based off of what we can offer, if you do not end up with a developer and an operator, then that project does not proceed, in which case you haven't even acquired the land at that point. You then reprogram it. That could easily be your cutoff point. That could probably be done in a matter of months, not taking a very long time to get to that point. After that, if you secured a developer and an operator, then you start marching down actually land acquisition and so on. There are still risks associated with it at that point, but hopefully those risks would be mitigated some. But you'd still have cutoff points along the way that you would have to make some determinations. But I think that first determination is get the land under an option and then cast out the net based off of what we can offer and see if it attracts a developer and an operator. And if it does not, then we quickly pivot to another project that's on this list, or we fund more deeply the projects that are already on the list. I think you have to do that because, again, we've got basically 2.5 years, and on a project like this, it could take every bit of that to actually make that. Now, we're not building the grocery store, so the good thing is if you land the operator and the developer, and you've got a development agreement attached with those incentives, then in many ways, and you start going down the land acquisition, our part's done. Everything after that becomes performance by the private developer. So it may take them longer to actually deliver the product. It won't affect us because our piece will be done. But you will have those cutoff points. All right, let me talk then about wrapping this up. First, again, thank you all because I know this is painful. I can't even imagine. I can only imagine the comments that we're getting on Facebook right now. So I'm sure that they're good because this stuff is, it's the stuff that's easy to criticize when you're on the outside watching it, and you all know how hard it is to actually craft this in a way that makes sense and that actually you feel like actually respects what is the charges and what the challenges are. So I really do appreciate the dedication that you all have provided all through this process, and especially tonight to kind of take this next step. What I would like to do in full transparency, I've already started the draft of the background of the document and stuff. I have not filled in, because I had to wait for tonight to fill in these pieces. So what I would like to do then is I will craft a draft of the report that will go to the council on the 20th. I will email that out to each of you so that I can solicit individual comments from you all. Based off of those individual comments, then I will have to make a determination as to, has something gone off the rails? Do you as a group disagree with where that product ended up, that it doesn't really reflect what we've talked about here? And if so, then I have to figure out what I do with that, because we can't meet in any other way except this. I can't have everybody join in on a Zoom call. I can't have everyone join in on emails. I can individually email you. I can't do group emails and stuff in that kind of exchange. So I'm going to trust that I'll be able to reflect accurately what you all have shared. I'm going to email that out so that you can react and respond to it. Based on that, I'll know where we are in terms of getting that final recommendation. That also means, in fairness, that means that because we've not really been able to cover those shorter term kinds of projects, I'm going to put some of those in there as, again, examples. And so take a look at those. And if you disagree with any of those being examples, I need to know that as we go through. I will also introduce the concept that has been talked about here of a part of this which is not allocated through this process but made available through some kind of solicitation from the community directly. So I'll include that in there as well. So you all get that, take a look at it, respond to me individually. I'll send it out to you as a group, but I need individual responses, not reply all responses, because we can't do that since you are an official body of the council. If all of that goes fine, if when you see it you feel comfortable with what it shows and what it says, then again, that's what will be presented to the council on the 20th. As I've mentioned a few times here today, there will be several other processes with many of those after that. Some of those, again, will result in direct funding. Some of those will result in another process using some of our existing systems, and some of those will result in some kind of RFP kind of process that will bring partners together as we try to develop these further. So that's how those next pieces will interact. And again, there may be pieces of that I would grab portions of this group to participate in as well. Again, technically, you cease to exist once the recommendations are made, but I don't want to, yeah, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? You cease to exist. this panel ceases to exist, the members are very alive and vibrant. And so, but to John's point, you know, there may be questions along the way as we try to implement it that I need to reach out to you all to get some feedback in it. The good thing is at that point, you're no longer a panel, so I can actually have different conversations with you that I might be able to as an official body of the council as we go in. So again, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say these are the 9 priorities that have been identified by this group. I'm gonna allocate in those big buckets the funding that at least makes those reasonable. I'm going to allocate funding that's in the recovery side, and then ultimately council is going to decide what specifically gets funded under each of those specific initiatives. And I'll be honest, council may actually not be able to do that until we advance further in some of the discussions on some of those projects, but at least they'll know more or less what's going to be dedicated to those efforts. Everybody understand that, and is everyone okay with that? Because the rule of consensus is you at least agree not to object to it moving forward. So as long as no one's objecting to that, we will consider your work completed. And then I'm going to turn it over to Trish so she can wrap us up. And again, I really, really do thank you all, because I know this is not how you anticipated a couple of months ago, spending every one of your Wednesday nights for the last month. I also would encourage you, if you're able to make the council meeting, even though it'd be close quarters with this many people in it, I would still encourage you on the 20th, assuming everything stays on track, that you attend and be able to celebrate what it is that you've accomplished in moving this challenging, probably frustrating process at times. But the thing to remember at the end of this is these items that you've identified are a real possibility of using these dollars to make real difference in this community. And many of the ideas that you've talked about that did not make the list are ideas that we will continue to further explore other funding opportunities beyond these as well. So your involvement, just like those that completed the survey, just like those that attended the public hearing, has definitely dramatically affected what ends up in this listing and what's going forward. So for that, I really do thank you all for that work, and certainly thank the folks from RVTV who have been here alongside you every single time to cover this. Angie for all her help in running all over the place and making sure all of this works. Vice Mayor and the Mayor who have been presiding over this and who I know will share with the rest of the council the seriousness with which you all have conducted your charge, and convey some of these conversations with them as well. So with that, Trish.
Thank you, Bob. I will say on behalf of the mayor and the other members of council, we are truly grateful for everything that you've done, for coming out and supporting us. You have truly made our job a whole lot easier, because what we just went through and what we just hashed out would have taken us weeks as members of council. And so with all of us being here together, we have come a long way. And I did reiterate the fact that it is a recommendation, and it is a good recommendation. So I just want to say thank you. Normally I would say if all hearts and minds are clear, I don't know that might be the case tonight. We still might have a lot on our hearts and our minds, but I will have to adjourn this meeting. And thanks again.